There are moments in history that make you wince. And then there are moments that make you laugh before realizing you probably shouldn't be laughing at all. Because sometimes punishment wasn't about pain or justice. It was about performance, a show for the crowd, a theater where humiliation was the script and the condemned the unwilling actor. Welcome to the darker side of human creativity, where cruelty and comedy share the same stage. Let's step into medieval England, a place where drunken nights could destroy your dignity faster than any hangover. Imagine this. After one too many pints of ale, you stumble out of the tavern, declaring your love to a horse and trying to pay your bill with a button. The next morning, you're not fined, you're costumed. Your sentence, the drunkard's cloak, it wasn't cloth, it was a barrel. A splintered wooden cask, hollowed and fitted with 2 small holes for your arms and 1 for your head. The stench of beer clings to you. Your body is trapped, your pride stripped. And then the real punishment begins. You're paraded through town, a living joke, wobbling and sweating under the midday sun, your bare feet scraping against the stone. Children point, old women laugh. Men throw comments sharper than the barrel's edges. You're not being corrected, you're being displayed. A moving warning sign, drink too much and this is what you become. For the people watching, it's hilarious. For you, it's hell. The wooden shell becomes heavier with every step, every laugh, every reminder that you've stopped being a person. You're now the village's daily entertainment. And here's the truth beneath the laughter. The drunkard's cloak wasn't designed to kill you. It was designed to break you, not your bones, but your spirit. A punishment that relied on shame instead of blood. Because in the medieval world, laughter was a weapon. The crowd's amusement wasn't innocent, it was a ritual of control. Every jeer reinforced order. Every smirk reminded you that belonging came at the price of obedience. And perhaps that's the cruelest joke of all. While the man in the barrel was trapped by wood and humiliation, the people laughing at him were trapped too by fear. Fear of becoming the next act in the same grim comedy. So when we look back and laugh at the absurdity of history, maybe we're missing something. The drunkard's cloak isn't just a dumb punishment. It's a mirror, showing us that every society, even ours, still finds comfort in someone else's public shame. If the drunkard's cloak was a punishment of sight, forcing you to become a walking joke, then the next one's attacked something even more sacred, sound. In 17th century Germany, music wasn't just entertainment. It was considered a reflection of the soul, a bridge between man and God, which made being a bad musician a kind of moral crime. And the punishment for such an offense was as poetic as it was absurd. They called it the shame flute or Schandflirt. Imagine a heavy iron flute, beautifully engraved, cold to the touch, locked around your neck. Your fingers clamped into fixed playing positions. You couldn't make a single note. You just looked like you could. The townspeople would follow as you were paraded through the streets, your silent metal instrument gleaming under the sun. You were a performer without a sound, a living statue screaming, "I am terrible at this." A punishment that weaponized irony, turning art into mockery. What makes it fascinating isn't the absurdity, but the philosophy behind it. To the people of that time, bad art wasn't harmless, it was corruption. A sign of spiritual decay that needed to be corrected in public. So they silenced you by exaggerating your failure, forcing your shame to play the only melody the crowd wanted to hear: laughter. Across the border in medieval France, sound was punished differently. Here, being too loud, gossiping, shouting, disturbing the peace, could earn you the role of an unwilling street performer. The noisy neighbor was forced to march through town banging pots and pans, symbolically recreating the chaos they'd caused. A punishment so wonderfully backward it could only have been invented by people who truly believed that the best way to fight noise was with more noise. Imagine the absurd procession, the offender red-faced, clanging metal lids, while the villagers follow, cheering like it's a festival. It was comedy with a purpose, ridicule disguised as civic order. But beneath the laughter, there's something deeply human and deeply sad. Both the shame flute and the noise parade show how obsessed we've always been with public perfection. A world where to be mocked was to be erased, where the worst thing you could be wasn't evil, but embarrassing. And maybe that's the note history keeps playing over and over again. That fear of humiliation is more powerful than fear of pain, because pain fades, but shame echoes. If sight and sound weren't enough, history found a way to punish through taste, by turning the simple act of eating and drinking into instruments of torment. Let's begin in ancient Babylon, under the rule of Hammurabi, the king who believed that every crime deserved a poetic response. His code of laws didn't just govern trade and family. It reached into the taverns and breweries. For brewers who dared to water down their beer, there was no fine, no warning. The sentence was brutal, final, and morbidly ironic. You would be drowned in your own inferior beer, its justice served cold and wet. There was no appeal, no trial by jury. The same vat that birthed your deceit would become your tomb. To the Babylonians, this wasn't madness, it was balance. Your product defined your integrity, and your failure would consume you literally. But the idea of poetic punishment didn't end in Babylon. Centuries later, the Aztecs turned drinking into a deadly gamble. Their society valued discipline and order above all, and drunkenness was seen as a collapse of self-control, an insult to the gods who governed balance. For the first offense, the punishment was humiliation. Your head was shaved completely bald, marking you as a fool in the eyes of the community. The message was clear. You've lost your reason, and with it, your dignity. But if you dared to drink again, there was no second chance. The punishment was simple: death. From public laughter to public execution, one slip away. It was morality with no middle ground. A world where discipline wasn't taught, it was enforced with fear. And then there were the Prussians, masters of rigid discipline and psychological punishment. Their solution for public drunkenness wasn't execution, it was humiliation that stuck, quite literally. The offender would be handed a toothbrush, yes, a toothbrush, and ordered to scrub the public latrines. Not symbolic scrubbing, real, nauseating hands and knees scrubbing. It wasn't about hygiene, it was about disgust. The smell, the filth, the crawling insects, all combined into a lesson you'd never forget. In their minds, this was genius. You link the joy of alcohol with the horror of human waste, and you've built the perfect deterrent. One that doesn't just punish the body, it rewires the brain. Each of these punishments reveals a strange truth about the people who invented them. They didn't just want to make you suffer. They wanted you to repent through your senses. To see your failure, taste it, smell it, to live inside your own guilt until it became unbearable. It's as if humanity, through all its civilizations, kept finding new ways to season cruelty with irony. And somewhere between the barrel, the beer, and the toothbrush, justice began to taste less like righteousness and more like revenge. If history teaches us anything, it's this: the loudest voices often pay the highest price. And in a world built by men, those voices were almost always women's. In medieval Europe, words could wound reputations faster than any blade, and so the act of speaking became a crime. A careless whisper could label you a gossip. A raised voice could brand you a scold. And punishment wasn't silence. It was humiliation wrapped in wood, water, and iron. Let's begin with the gossip's violin, a cruel parody of an instrument. It wasn't made to play music, it was made to play shame. A hinged wooden board with holes for 2 heads and 4 hands, locking 2 accused gossips face to face, barely inches apart. They would stand there for hours, trapped in forced intimacy, forced to look into each other's eyes, the same eyes that once conspired in whispered secrets. Around them, villagers gathered, watching their discomfort like theater. The punishment wasn't pain. It was awkwardness turned weapon. No screaming, no blood, only silence, sweat, and regret. 2 people who had shared words were now prisoners of them. Then came the ducking stool, a punishment for women who dared to argue, criticize, or simply refuse to be silent. A wooden chair attached to a long beam, balanced over a river or pond. The scold would be strapped in and lowered into the cold water, again and again. The logic was laughably cruel. The chill would cool her temper. But the truth was darker. This was torture disguised as therapy. Each plunge stripped away not just air, but dignity. And when she was finally pulled up, gasping and shivering, the crowd would cheer, believing they had tamed a spirit too wild for their comfort. Yet the most horrifying invention of all was the scold's bridle, a metal cage locked around a woman's head. It pressed down on the tongue with a sharp, spiked plate, ensuring that any attempt to speak would draw blood. Imagine the sound of the iron clinking as she walked, the weight on her skull, the humiliation burning in her chest. She wasn't silenced by law, she was silenced by fear. The cruelty wasn't random, it was systemic. Each device, each ritual was built to erase something society couldn't control, a woman's voice. Because a woman who spoke was dangerous. She could question, she could challenge, she could lead. And so, history found ways to cage the tongue without drawing swords. But silence doesn't equal peace. Every suppressed voice leaves an echo, one that grows louder with time. The laughter of the crowd may have drowned out her screams, but centuries later, it's her silence we still hear. If shame could crush the spirit, then pride was its sharpest target. Throughout history, societies obsessed with honor found ingenious ways to destroy it, not through pain, but through humiliation so deep that even survival felt like defeat. In medieval Europe, reputation was life itself. Lose it, and you might as well be dead. Which is why one of the cruelest punishments wasn't execution, it was mockery. Those who committed petty crimes or defied authority were forced to wear the cap and bells, the flamboyant costume of a court jester. Brightly colored fabric, oversized sleeves, and a jingling hat that announced your every movement. Each step you took sang your disgrace. Each bell was a reminder that you'd become the village clown. You weren't chained, but you couldn't hide. You could walk freely through the town, but every laugh, every smirk was another lash on your pride. In that world, ridicule hurt more than ropes ever could. But humiliation wasn't limited to jesters and fools. Even the strongest men, soldiers, warriors, could be stripped of dignity with a single garment. In the Roman army, courage wasn't just expected, it was worshipped. To falter in battle was to betray Rome itself. And for those who showed cowardice, punishment came not through sword or spear, but through fabric. They were forced to wear the tunic of a woman, the tunic mulibris. A soldier would stand in the center of camp, surrounded by his comrades, draped in soft, flowing fabric meant for women. In that hyper-masculine world, this was worse than flogging. It was a declaration that he had failed not only as a warrior, but as a man. The laughter of his brothers in arms wasn't amusement. It was a weapon. The humiliation was calculated, a reminder that in Rome, masculinity itself could be stripped away as easily as armor. It's strange, isn't it? How societies obsessed with strength used humiliation as their sharpest blade. They believed dignity could be destroyed publicly and restored only through obedience. To them, laughter was control, ridicule was law, but humiliation doesn't always teach obedience. Sometimes it breeds quiet rebellion. The man forced to wear the jester's bells learns how to move in rhythm with the laughter, and one day, use it against those who mocked him. The soldier humiliated in silk may still march again, his shame hardening into rage. History's cruelest punishments were meant to erase pride, but more often than not, they revealed something far more dangerous. That the human spirit, once broken, learns not just to endure ridicule, but to rise above it. Not every punishment left scars on the body. Some worked on the mind, slow, invisible, and devastating. In ancient civilizations where art was sacred, the line between creation and crime could blur. And when your art failed, justice struck not with a sword, but with irony. In ancient Athens, the birthplace of philosophy and theater, public entertainment was almost holy. The Greeks believed that plays shaped morality, that tragedy could purify the soul. But what happened when the performance wasn't noble or wise or even bearable? They called it a punishment for offending the intellect. If you were a playwright whose work was unbearable, wooden dialogue, nonsensical plots, characters so lifeless they could make statues yawn, you could be forced to watch your own bad play. It sounds almost funny until you imagine it. Tied to a stone seat in an open-air theater, the sun burning your face, hours of your own words echoing around you, delivered by bored actors, mocked by the crowd. You weren't being tortured physically. You were drowning in your own mediocrity. It was a form of psychological dissection, forcing the artist to confront every failure, every flaw, every moment that betrayed their ambition. To the Greeks, this wasn't cruelty. It was correction. They believed that through suffering, even bad art could lead to wisdom. Centuries later, the Romans took that same concept and sharpened it. If you were a poet and your verses were dreadful, not just dull, but embarrassingly awful, you wouldn't be flogged or banished. No, Rome had a far more refined torture. You'd be forced to rewrite your own terrible poems again and again until your overseer decided they were acceptable. Imagine the despair, the ink-stained hands, the parchment that mocks you with every line. You rewrite and rewrite, and it never gets better because you can't get better under threat. You're trapped in a cycle of self-loathing so perfect it doesn't need chains. It's almost poetic, punished not by others' cruelty but by your own mediocrity. The Romans understood something chilling, that the deepest punishment isn't pain, it's reflection. They didn't need to destroy you physically. They let your mind do the work, because the worst prison is built inside your own thoughts, and maybe that's why these punishments feel timeless. Even today, failure still haunts the creative. The artist, the writer, the musician, all still fear the same invisible courtroom of judgment. The faces have changed. The methods have softened. But the verdict remains the same. You must live with your own creation until it breaks you or remakes you. There are chapters in history so strange that they sound like satire, yet they are completely real. One of the most baffling among them, the age when animals were put on trial. It began in medieval Europe when the church and law shared the same stage, and the idea of divine order ruled every thought. To those people, justice didn't just belong to humans, it belonged to the entire creation. So when animals broke that order, they too had to face the law. Yes, pigs, rats, goats, and even swarms of locusts were summoned to court. They had lawyers, witnesses, and sometimes even official sentences. A pig that attacked a child could be formally arrested, dressed in human clothes, and marched to the gallows. Rats that ate grain might receive a written summons to appear in court, and if they didn't show up, their lawyer might plead that the roads were unsafe due to cats. It sounds absurd now, but in their minds, it wasn't comedy. It was cosmic fairness. If God ruled over all living beings, then all living beings could be held accountable. Justice was universal, even if it was idiotic. One recorded trial in 1386 tells of a pig in France charged with murdering a child. The court appointed a defense attorney, witnesses testified, and the verdict, guilty, was carried out in front of a cheering crowd. The pig was hanged in public, wearing a human jacket and trousers, as if the costume made the punishment make sense. It's disturbing to imagine, but beneath the absurdity lies a powerful truth. Humans have always projected their own morality onto the world around them. We needed our laws to feel complete, so we forced them upon everything, even beasts that knew no sin. And it didn't stop with pigs. Records show weevils and caterpillars were sued for destroying crops. Judges ordered them to leave within 6 days or face excommunication. Some trials even ended with negotiations, where farmers agreed to set aside a small field for the insects to feed on peacefully. It was humanity's attempt to reason with nature, and a perfect metaphor for our arrogance. We've always wanted control, even over the uncontrollable. When storms destroyed crops, when rats invaded barns, people couldn't accept randomness. There had to be guilt. There had to be someone or something to blame. These animal trials were never really about pigs or rats. They were about us, about a species so desperate for order that it would drag the innocent, the voiceless, even the inhuman into its theater of justice. It's easy to laugh at now, but if you look closely, the same instinct remains today. Our need to point fingers, to demand punishment when chaos strikes, even if no one is truly at fault. The costumes are gone. The gallows are history. But the illusion of control, that old, dangerous faith in our own logic, still walks among us. Some punishments weren't meant to reform or humiliate. They were meant to erase. Across centuries, justice often took the shape of ritual, elaborate, symbolic, and disturbingly precise. When societies wanted to make an example, they didn't just kill. They choreographed death. In ancient Rome, crime against family, the most sacred bond of all, demanded a punishment worthy of legend. It was called pona culle, the punishment of the sack. If a person murdered a parent or close relative, execution wasn't enough. The Romans believed such an act disrupted the natural order, and only chaos could cleanse it. The condemned was beaten, then sewn into a thick leather sack, but not alone. Inside the sack with them were a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. 4 living symbols of madness, sin, and disorder thrashing together in the darkness. The sack was then hurled into the river. No blood spilled. No final words. Only the muffled, horrifying struggle of life devouring life until silence returned. Why those animals? Historians still argue. Some say the dog represented loyalty betrayed. The rooster, a mockery of dawn, the light that would never come. the viper, deceit, and the monkey, humanity's own distorted reflection. Together, they made a grim menagerie of our worst instincts, sealed with the murderer who embodied them. It was justice as theater, a ritual sacrifice to remind the living that disobedience to order would not just end life, it would damn the soul. But Rome wasn't alone in this obsession with ceremonial cruelty. In the Roman religion of Vesta, purity was sacred, embodied by the Vestal virgins, women sworn to celibacy for 30 years, tending the eternal flame that protected Rome. Breaking that vow was considered treason against the gods, yet Roman law forbade spilling of Vestal's blood, so they found a loophole, a masterpiece of cold logic. The guilty Vestal was led to an underground chamber. Inside, a small couch, a lamp, and a few days' worth of food. She was left there alive. Then the chamber was sealed and the earth above her flattened. No blood spilled, no executioner's hand. She simply ceased to exist, her life absorbed into the silence beneath the city she once protected. It was a horror disguised as piety. A society convincing itself that murder was holiness, as long as it obeyed its own rules. Meanwhile, in imperial China, punishment could be as ritualistic as it was merciless. The Ting Jiang, the public flogging of the buttocks, was reserved for disgraced officials and scholars. Before the emperor and court, the condemned was stripped of his lower garments and beaten with long bamboo rods. It wasn't just pain, it was annihilation of face, the most sacred element of Chinese honor. Every strike echoed not just through the body, but through the man's name, his ancestors, his descendants. Some never recovered, not because of their wounds, but because they had been erased socially. In that society, losing one's dignity was worse than death itself. From Rome to China, these rituals reveal the same dark truth. When societies fear chaos, they sanctify cruelty. They turn execution into ceremony, suffering into order. And in doing so, they give their violence meaning. But perhaps that's what makes it even more terrifying. Not that humans kill, but that we can make killing feel righteous. By the dawn of the Victorian era, the world had changed. Empires had risen. Science had replaced superstition. But cruelty, it didn't disappear. It simply learned to wear a uniform. Gone were the burning stakes and iron cages. In their place came machines, silent, efficient, and soul-crushing. Punishment was no longer about blood or spectacle. It became about breaking the mind. The Victorians believed in discipline above all else. They worshipped order, obedience, and productivity. And so they built the perfect tool for punishment, something that looked like work but meant absolutely nothing. They called it the treadmill. Picture this, an enormous wooden cylinder fitted with steps turning endlessly under the weight of human legs. Dozens of prisoners, shoulder to shoulder, climbing in unison upward but going nowhere. 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. No conversation, no rest, no meaning. Each step was a lesson, suffering without purpose. And the cruelest part, sometimes the wheel didn't even power anything. No grain was milled, no water was pumped. It was just movement, an illusion of labor designed to erase the will to resist. Guards called it moral exercise, but there was nothing moral about it. It was exhaustion masquerading as redemption. When prisoners began collapsing from sheer fatigue, authorities devised a solution. They invented a smaller device, one that could be used in solitary confinement. A simple iron handle attached to a resistance box. It did nothing, created nothing, achieved nothing. They called it the crank. Each prisoner had to complete a daily quota, 10,000 turns or more. Every rotation took force, every turn burned muscle, and every moment whispered the same message: you are nothing. And here's the dark brilliance of it: the crank wasn't broken. It wasn't connected to a mill or machine. It simply didn't need to be. Its only purpose was to teach futility, to make a man question the point of his own existence. In a strange way, the treadmill and the crank were the industrial versions of medieval torture. Only now, the pain came not from the whip, but from repetition, from the unbearable weight of meaninglessness. Because the Victorians understood something terrifying about the human spirit, that the surest way to destroy it isn't through pain or fear, but through endless, pointless labor. This was punishment as philosophy, a system that believed rehabilitation meant submission. To make men moral, they first had to make them mechanical. And so, the wheel kept turning, the crank kept grinding, and the men who once had names became numbers, their humanity stripped away one empty step at a time. When you think about it, these machines were the ancestors of something we still live with today. The kind of work that drains the soul while pretending to build character. The illusion that effort alone is virtue, even when it leads nowhere. Maybe the treadmill never really disappeared. It just got quieter. Every empire, no matter how enlightened, eventually discovers that fear is easier to manage than freedom. And when fear becomes law, punishment turns into theater, a performance of power meant not to correct the guilty, but to remind everyone else who rules. In imperial China, this theater took a simple, horrifying shape: the kangu, or wooden collar. A flat, square board, wide enough to stretch from shoulder to shoulder, with a hole carved in the center for the neck. The condemned wore it like a cross between a yoke and a coffin lid. It was heavy, sometimes over 20 kilograms, and it locked tight. But its cruelty wasn't in its weight, it was in its design. The collar was so wide that the prisoner couldn't feed himself. His hands couldn't reach his mouth. He couldn't sleep comfortably, couldn't clean himself, couldn't even swat away flies. To eat or drink, he had to depend on strangers, on mercy. And mercy in those streets was a rare commodity. The kangu turned punishment into public theater, a living warning not just of crime but of disobedience. Every passerby saw him, a body bent under wood and shame, and thought, that could be me. But the genius of the kangu was subtle. It outsourced cruelty to the crowd. The emperor didn't need to whip you or starve you himself. He just made sure you couldn't survive without compassion, and then left you to test whether society still had any. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman Empire, a different kind of control was brewing, quite literally. There was a time when coffee was seen as subversive, not because of caffeine, but because of conversation. Coffee houses had become places where people shared ideas, and ideas were dangerous. Sultan Murad Roman IV, terrified of rebellion, banned coffee entirely. But he didn't stop at closing cafes. If you were caught drinking coffee, you could be beaten, caught again, and you might be sewn into a leather bag and thrown into the Bosphorus, a punishment as dramatic as it was insane. Think about that. A man sipping a cup of coffee, something we now associate with quiet mornings and calm, was once committing an act of treason punishable by drowning. It wasn't about the drink. It was about the dialogue. Because tyrants have always known, the most dangerous ideas are the ones shared over something warm between friends. And in imperial China, control went even deeper, into ink and language itself. Within the emperor's bureaucracy, the written word was sacred. Every document, every decree had to be perfect. A single misplaced character in an official letter to the emperor wasn't a mistake. It was blasphemy. Scribes and scholars could be executed for a typo. Some were stripped of rank. Others were exiled to remote, frozen provinces, punished not for treason, but for carelessness. Imagine living in a world where one slip of the brush could end your life, where the act of writing wasn't expression but survival. It was the ultimate form of control, domination not over bodies but over thoughts. If you can terrify someone into silence, you don't need to censor them. They'll censor themselves. From the Ottoman cafes to the Chinese courts, power learned to weaponize order. Every law, every rule, every punishment carried one message. Don't just obey, anticipate what obedience looks like. And that's the most dangerous kind of control, because it doesn't need chains. It only needs fear. Before reason, before science, there was only faith, and faith, when mixed with fear, can create the cruelest form of justice. In the Middle Ages, when courts couldn't find evidence, they turned to the heavens for answers. The logic was simple and terrifying. If God is just, He will protect the innocent. So they invented something called the trial by ordeal, a divine test where your survival proved your purity. One of the most infamous forms was the ordeal of boiling water. The accused would kneel before a cauldron, steam curling into the air, priests chanting Latin prayers. Then, under the gaze of the entire village, they would plunge their arm into the scalding water to retrieve a stone or a ring from the bottom. The pain was immediate. The skin blistered. The smell of burnt flesh mixed with incense. When it was done, the wound was wrapped and sealed with wax by the priest. For 3 days, accused waited. If the burn healed cleanly, they were declared innocent, a sign that God had protected them. If it festered or turned black, they were guilty. It was faith weaponized into theater, a ritual of suffering masquerading as divine judgment. But not all ordeals involved heat. Some called upon water's purity in another way. There was also the ordeal of cold water, often used in witch trials. The accused would be bound and thrown into a river or lake. If they floated, it was proof that they had rejected baptism, a proof of witchcraft. If they sank, they were innocent and dead. It was a perfect system, perfect. That is, if your goal was to prove that fear worked better than truth. And through it all, the church believed it was serving God. The priests didn't see cruelty, they saw divine justice made visible. Each blister, each drowning, was an offering to the idea that God Himself sat in judgment through human hands. Yet what these ordeals truly revealed wasn't the will of heaven, it was the desperation of man. People needed to believe there was order in a chaotic world, that sin could be measured, that guilt could be burned away, that suffering could mean something. Because if pain had meaning, then life, even in its brutality, still had purpose. When we look back now, it's easy to call it madness. But deep down, the impulse remains the same. We still cling to systems that promise moral clarity, even when they fail us. We still believe that punishment, in some way, can cleanse. The difference is that today the fire is invisible. It burns in the form of judgment, reputation, or shame. And the crowd no longer gathers in the village square. They gather on screens. The trial never really ended. It just changed its tools. When justice fails, the crowd takes its place. And when the crowd takes over, punishment stops being law, it becomes spectacle. In colonial America, the age of liberty was also an age of fury. Communities were tight-knit, faith was strict, and shame was a weapon sharper than any sword. So when someone defied the rules, a tax collector, a traitor, or simply an unpopular neighbor, they weren't tried in court. They were tarred and feathered. It began with a mob. always a mob. The condemned was dragged into the street, stripped to the waist and pinned down. Hot pine tar, sticky, boiling, suffocating, was poured over their body. Then came the feathers, handfuls of them sticking to the tar like grotesque snow. When it was done, the victim wasn't a person anymore. They were a creature, a walking symbol of disgrace, part man, part nightmare. The tar burned deep, clinging to the skin, eating through hair and pores. Removing it later tore away flesh. But the real wound wasn't physical. It was the laughter, the jeers, the sense that your pain had become entertainment. They called it justice of the people. But it wasn't justice. It was theater, a ritual that made cruelty feel righteous. The mob always believes it's defending something sacred, a community, a belief, a flag. And that belief is what makes it dangerous. The same spirit of vengeance took another form in early America, the whipping post race. Instead of tying offenders to a post, the crowd gave them a head start. They'd release the condemned and chase them down the road, the sheriff cracking the whip behind them. If the offender was fast enough to cross the county line, they might escape with fewer lashes. If not, every step became agony. It was part punishment, part sport. A game of humiliation where pain was applause, where justice blurred into entertainment and suffering became communal bonding. It's easy to call this barbaric, but if we look closer, the mob's desire hasn't changed much. The tar and feathers are gone, replaced by hashtags and headlines. The square is digital now, and the jeering never ends. Public shaming has evolved, but the psychology remains ancient. We still crave unity through outrage. We still find comfort in pointing at the guilty, even before we know if they are. And deep down, every crowd believes the same lie, that if they punish hard enough, they'll purify themselves. But history whispers otherwise. The mob never heals. It only feeds, and every time it gathers, justice dies quietly beneath the noise. There is a kind of cruelty that doesn't come from rage or revenge, but from fascination. A dark curiosity with the body itself, as if pain and disgust could somehow teach morality. Across empires and centuries, human flesh became the canvas of justice. In ancient Egypt, where grandeur and order ruled every aspect of life, even small crimes were treated with ritual precision. For minor offenses, punishment came not from the whip or the sword, but from the stomach. They called it forced gluttony. The guilty were taken to a public square, surrounded by priests, officials, and gawking citizens. Then they were made to eat massive amounts of food, oily meats and honey cakes, washed down with wine far beyond what the body could handle. At first, it was indulgence. Then it was torment. Their bodies convulsed, sweat poured down, their faces twisted in nausea. And when they inevitably vomited, the crowd cheered. Justice, they believed, had been served. To the Egyptian mind, this was poetic. The crime had been greed, and the punishment was to drown in the very sin itself. It wasn't about death. It was about correction through disgust. Centuries later, in parts of Europe and Asia, that same logic reappeared, but sharper, crueler, and without the poetry. There were cases where criminals or rebels were forced to drink urine, a punishment with no real function except humiliation. It didn't wound the body, it degraded the soul. It made the offender feel less than human, because to those who designed such punishments, degradation was the purest form of control. They understood something chilling. Pain could make you defiant, but disgust makes you compliant. And in imperial China, punishment once again turned the body into a performance, this time through starvation. The cangu, The wooden collar of shame wasn't just a restraint, it was a slow execution. Too wide to allow self-feeding, too heavy to sleep in, it turned survival into a public question. Could the condemned find kindness among strangers before their body gave up? Every passerby became part of the punishment, deciding whether to show mercy or watch them waste away. The law didn't need to kill you directly. It just made sure the world watched as you slowly disappeared. All these punishments shared a single, grim philosophy. That morality could be written on the body. That shame could be engraved into muscle and bone. That if you made the flesh suffer enough, the soul would eventually obey. But they all forgot one truth. You can twist the body, but you cannot discipline the human hunger for dignity. Because even as people gagged, choked, or starved, something inside them resisted, a spark that refused to accept that degradation was ever justice. That's what history's cruelest punishments truly reveal. Not the power of pain, but the resilience of those forced to endure it. Some of history's cruelest punishments weren't born from hatred, they were born from love. Twisted, zealous, irrational love for gods, for purity, for order. Because when faith becomes obsession, mercy becomes impossible. No civilization embodied that contradiction more vividly than ancient Egypt, a land that built monuments to eternity, but also laws that worshipped absurdity. The Egyptians revered cats not as pets, but as divine guardians, symbols of grace and protection, believed to embody the goddess Bastet. To harm one was to offend the heavens. According to the historian Herodotus, killing a cat, even by accident, was a capital crime. No trial, no appeal. An angry mob could tear you apart in the street before a single judge was summoned. And when a family's beloved cat died of natural causes, they were required to shave off their eyebrows as a sign of mourning. Imagine it, an empire where your eyebrows, not your words, announced your grief. A world where the life of a feline held more sacred weight than the lives of most men. It sounds absurd now, but at its heart, this was devotion turned law. A society that so deeply feared chaos that it built its morality on ritualized reverence. They believed that if they protected their symbols, their gods would protect them. It was faith made tangible and terrifying. But Egypt wasn't alone in binding death and devotion together. Thousands of years later, across the world, another ritual emerged that blurred the line between piety and madness: necrogamy, the marriage to the dead. It was practiced in parts of medieval Europe and later formalized in France during the 20th century under extraordinary circumstances. If a man and woman were engaged, but the man died before the wedding, the bride could petition the government to marry his corpse. A legal ceremony, rings, vows, and all performed beside a coffin. At first glance, it was compassion. It granted the grieving bride social status, inheritance rights, and a strange kind of closure. But beneath the sentiment lay something darker, the human need to make order out of loss. To believe that love could conquer not just distance or time, but death itself. It wasn't about romance. It was about control. A desperate refusal to let go, to accept that some endings cannot be rewritten by ritual. Throughout history, that's been our pattern. We take the things we fear most, death, chaos, grief, and we wrap them in ceremony, hoping it makes them smaller, safer, understandable. But it never does. The Egyptians' cats, the widow's ghost, weddings, all born from the same longing, to command what cannot be commanded. And in doing so, humanity crossed into something far more dangerous than cruelty, delusion disguised as devotion. When you look at these rituals now, they seem like relics of superstition, but their spirit still lingers. We still build systems, laws, even technologies to tame the uncontrollable. We still believe that if we bow correctly, love deeply, or obey perfectly, we can keep death at bay. It's the oldest illusion in history, that the universe can be reasoned with, if only we suffer beautifully enough. When we look back at these punishments, the barrels and the flutes, the sacks and the fires, the whips and the laughter, it's easy to mock the past, to say how foolish they were. But history doesn't exist to make us feel superior. It exists to hold up a mirror, and that mirror is still cracked, still reflecting us. Because the truth is, every absurd punishment we've seen, every dumb ritual of justice was never truly about crime. It was about control. Every barrel, every collar, every iron mask was designed to keep fear alive, not in the condemned, but in the crowd. Fear is the oldest law humanity ever wrote. Fear of chaos, fear of embarrassment, fear of being different, from Babylon's brewers drowned in beer to the women silenced in iron, from Rome's floggings of dignity to Victorian prisons of futility. Each act carried the same whisper: obey, or we will make you a lesson. But here's what makes it even darker. They believed they were doing good. Every ruler, priest, and magistrate convinced themselves that cruelty could teach virtue, that shame could build morality, that pain could save the soul. And maybe that's the greatest horror of all. Not that people were evil, but that they were convinced they were right. History's dumbest punishments weren't accidents. They were mirrors of our own logic, stretched to its breaking point. Because every generation thinks it has finally civilized suffering, that its laws are enlightened, its justice humane. Yet we still humiliate, still ostracize, still destroy. Only now the methods have changed. We no longer march offenders through town. We just trend them on screens. We no longer build pillories in the square. We build them in comment sections. And we still call it justice. So maybe the line between ancient absurdity and modern morality isn't as clear as we like to think. Maybe history's cruel theater never closed. It just changed its stage lighting. As you reach the end of this journey through humanity's strangest punishments, ask yourself, are we truly wiser or just more discreet? Do we punish to correct or to feel superior? Do we seek justice or entertainment? Because every time we laugh at the foolishness of the past quietly laughs back. And perhaps that is history's final lesson. That civilization doesn't erase cruelty. It only learns how to justify it more beautifully. If this exploration made you question what we call justice, then maybe that's the first step towards something better. Because history isn't there to make us comfortable. It's there to remind us painfully, absurdly, brilliantly, what we still are.